There's a piece of bread rising on a counter somewhere right now, doing something it has done for at least 14,400 years. You were probably taught it came after farming. Grow the wheat, get a surplus, then bread. That's backwards. In 2018, archaeologists in Jordan's Black Desert found charred flatbread at a site called Shubeika 1, baked by hunter-gatherers who had never planted a seed on purpose. Radiocarbon dating put the remains at 14,600 to 11,600 years old, at least 4,000 years before agriculture existed anywhere in that region. Scanning electron microscopy confirmed it wasn't porridge. It was bread, made from wild einkorn wheat and the tubers of a marsh plant, ground by hand, baked on a hot stone, with no fields anywhere in sight. So if bread didn't come from farming, where did farming come from? That's the question this whole episode quietly answers. Tonight, the questions people actually ask about bread. Is sourdough really different? Should you actually worry about gluten? Answered properly. Plus, 2 true stories proving this thing on your counter has been quietly running civilization since before civilization existed. Here's the part that should bother you more than it does. For almost that entire 14,000-year run, nobody knew why bread worked. Leavened bread rises because wild yeast, invisible, floating in the air, living in flour, living on hands, eats sugar and exhales carbon dioxide. That gas is what inflates the dough. But nobody proved a living organism was doing this until Louis Pasteur in the 1850s and 60s. Every loaf baked before that point was an act of trust in a process nobody could see, name, or explain. People noticed that if they waited, it worked, so they did it again. For 14,000 years. We still do this, by the way. Most people eating bread tonight couldn't explain fermentation, or gluten formation, or the Maillard reaction that browns a crust, any better than a hunter-gatherer at Shubeika could have. The dough never needed our understanding. It only ever needed our repetition. Here's a true story almost nobody knows. In 1928, in Chillicothe, Missouri, a man named Otto Rohwedder finally got his automatic bread slicing machine to market after an earlier prototype had burned down in a fire and cost him nearly a decade to rebuild. It was, at that point, younger than commercial radio. People loved it. Sales took off fast enough that by 1930, Wonder Bread was selling pre-sliced loaves nationwide. Then, on January 18, 1943, in the middle of World War II, the US government banned it. Claude Wickard, head of the War Food Administration, ordered pre-sliced bread off the shelves, officially for wartime conservation, though even then, nobody fully agreed on whether it was about steel for blades, wax paper, or flour costs, and Americans were furious. A Connecticut woman wrote to the New York Times that sliced bread was essential to her household's morale and saneness. Newspapers ran outraged headlines. The backlash was so loud, so fast, that the ban lasted barely 7 weeks before the government quietly reversed it on March 8th. 15 years. That's how long it took for slicing a loaf of bread to go from novelty to something an entire country considered too important to lose. So let's settle something. Should you be worried about gluten? First, what it even is. Gluten isn't an ingredient sitting in your flour, waiting to be released. It's 2 separate proteins, gliadin and glutenin, that mean nothing elastic on their own. Only when your hands hydrate them and physically work them do they tangle into the stretchy network you call gluten. You don't find gluten in dough. You build it with your knuckles in real time. Now, the question that matters. If you have celiac disease, an autoimmune condition, roughly 1% of people, gluten is genuinely medically dangerous, full stop, no debate. That part isn't up for discussion. But most people who believe they're sensitive to gluten don't have celiac disease, and here's where it gets uncomfortable. In rigorous double-blind trials, like where neither the participant nor the researcher knows what's actually being eaten, most self-identified gluten-sensitive people don't react to gluten at all. One widely cited trial found gluten-triggered symptoms in only about 8% of them once a different compound, FODMAPs, was accounted for. A 2023 study in the Lancet Gastroenterology and Hepatology pointed to something even simpler: the nocebo effect. Feeling sick because you expect to, regardless of what you actually ate. That doesn't mean nobody reacts to wheat outside celiac disease. There's a credible, still researched protein culprit called AT-IS. It means that for most people blaming gluten, the evidence says they've got the wrong suspect. Which brings us to the jar on your counter. Is sourdough actually better, or is that just marketing? 2 completely different claims get bundled together here, and only one of them survives contact with the research. Claim 1. This exact starter has been alive since 1849. San Francisco's Boudin Bakery markets theirs that way. The practice, feeding it, keeping it going, that part can genuinely be that old. But the population inside it is a separate question entirely. A global study sequencing 500 starters across 4 continents found no consistent regional fingerprint, no distinct San Francisco microbiome. And Marco Gabetti, a microbiologist who studies these communities, has said on record that he doubts any starter holds the same microbial population it started with, that constant flux may just be normal. The lineage is old. The specific organisms almost certainly are not. Claim 2. Slow fermentation actually changes how the bread behaves in your body. This one holds up. Bread made through hours of slow fermentation, the traditional way, measurably has a lower glycemic impact than bread made through fast industrial mixing. A real, sourced nutritional difference, not folklore. So the honest answer is, your starter probably isn't really a time capsule from 1849. But the slow, patient process it represents might genuinely be doing something for you that a fast loaf isn't. Here's the second story, and it's the one that should bother you the most. Let them eat cake is supposed to be Marie Antoinette's response to hearing the French poor had no bread. There's no contemporary evidence she ever said it. Originally, let them eat brioche, not cake, comes from Jean-Jacques Rousseau's Confessions, written around 1765, attributed to an unnamed great princess. At the time, Marie Antoinette was about 9 years old, still living in Austria. The quote wasn't connected to her name in print until 1843, 50 years after she had already been executed. Historians have found no evidence revolutionary pamphlets used it against her while she was alive. The attribution seems to have hardened decades later, during an 1870s political campaign to discredit the monarchy for good. The revolution needed a villain who didn't know her people were starving. History handed her the line anyway, and it stuck so much better than the truth that more than 2 centuries later, you probably believed it 5 minutes ago. Here's a fact that sounds made up but isn't. The crust and the inside of your bread are, chemically, 2 different foods. The crumb, the soft interior, can't get hotter than about 100 degrees Celsius because that's where water boils, and the dough stays wet enough to cap it there. The crust is different. Once the surface dries out and crosses that same line, it triggers something called the Maillard reaction. Amino acids and sugars colliding and rearranging into hundreds of new flavor and aroma compounds, plus separate caramelization on top of that. That's the browning, the smell, the actual reason bread tastes like bread. So every loaf you've ever eaten was secretly 2 different chemical events happening 1 centimeter apart, capped by nothing more dramatic than how hot water is allowed to get before it turns to steam. That same loaf splits in another way too. Not by chemistry this time, but by class. For most of European history, white bread was the rich man's food and brown bread was what the poor were stuck eating, because refining flour by hand was expensive. Then industrial milling made white flour cheap for everyone, and the wealthy quickly started buying brown bread again, just to stay different from people who could finally afford white. The bread didn't change. The money moved, and the bread just followed it across the room. One more invisible process, and this one we eventually decided to fight. Bread goes stale mainly through starch retrogradation, molecules slowly recrystallizing, squeezing out water, stiffening the crumb. It isn't really drying out. It's the bread's structure quietly rebuilding itself, the slow signature of time passing. The Chorleywood bread process, developed in England in 1961, jams that signal directly. A few minutes of intense mechanical mixing plus enzymes and emulsifiers that specifically interfere with starch recrystallization. By 2009, around 80% of UK bread was made this way. A week-old supermarket loaf isn't soft by accident. It's soft because the chemical signal that would normally tell you it's gone has been deliberately switched off. France did the opposite. Since 1993, anything legally sold as pain traditional français is allowed exactly 4 ingredients: flour, water, salt, yeast, no preservatives, no freezing, which means a truly legal traditional baguette goes stale within about a day by design, because the law specifically bans the tools that would stop it. One country spent the 20th century engineering staleness out of bread. Another wrote a law to protect its right to go stale. So here's what all of this actually adds up to. Bread is, as far as we can tell, the first technology humans ever built entirely on trust in something they couldn't see. For most of its 14,000-year history, nobody understood the microbiology, the chemistry, or the stories we told about it. And it didn't matter, because the dough never needed our understanding. It only needed our repetition. We did the same thing with the stories around bread that we did with the bread itself. trusted them, repeated them, and kept going long after the proof underneath had quietly gone stale. And if bread really did help talk us into farming, into settling down, building surplus, building hierarchy, building everything that came after, then one of the largest decisions our species ever made might not have been a plan at all. It might have just been an appetite, followed all the way to civilization. So pick a side. Did farming give us bread, or did wanting bread give us farming? Drop your answer in the comments. Then find someone who picked differently and make your case. If 10 minutes on a piece of bread just rearranged something you thought you knew, that's not an accident. That's the whole channel. Subscribe, and the next ordinary object gets opened the same way.